Back in 2020, I reviewed the Sigma 85mm f1.4 DN ART lens. Shortly thereafter, I purchased one, and it's been my go-to 85mm lens for the past 5 years. During that time, I have put it head-to-head against a variety of other 85mm lenses. First was the original 85mm f1.4 G Master, then later the GM Mark II. I've put it up against the Samyang AF 85mm f1.4, the Sirui Aurora 85mm f1.4, and those are just the head-to-head videos that I've done during that time. But it's always come out looking really good because it's got a great combination of build quality, autofocus performance, and of course, a really fantastic optical performance. Our favorite disruptor is back, and Viltrox has their new Pro AF 85mm f1.4, and it shares a lot of the same virtues as the Sigma does, but at a much lower price tag. So, is it now the season for my Sigma to be dethroned? That's what we're here to determine today. So we're gonna head into the lab and put these lenses head to head and see who comes out on top. Let's take a look. So we'll start off our discussion by looking at the ways that these lenses are similar, because the truth of the matter is that there's probably more commonality here than what I've seen between most of these lenses that I've done comparisons with in the past. So obviously we have the same focal length and the same maximum aperture, and in this case I would say that the focal length even behaves very similarly. I've seen in some cases where one lens appeared to be shorter or longer. In this case, they both seem to be about the same, so very similar in that regard. They also have a mostly similar feature set, and that includes the ability to declick an aperture, an AF/MF switch, a function or custom button that can be programmed. And there is one feature on the Sigma that's not present on the Viltrox, but we'll get to that in just a moment. They also have a very similar degree of overall build. They're made out of premium materials. They feel very high quality. They both have a similar degree of weather sealing. The Sigma has 11 sealing gaskets throughout. The Viltrox has 10. They both have a coating on the front element to help to resist fingerprints, water, all of those type things. They both have 11 aperture blades inside that do a pretty similar job of staying rounded as you stop the lens down. Furthermore, I found that in terms of doing things like aperture racking, for example, here you can see with the Viltrox that it's a nicely smooth process with the aperture declicked, and I could get good aperture racks. I could do the same with Sigma in very similar fashion and get very similar types of results. And so really they're very similar in that regard. I also found that they are very similar in terms of their maximum magnification. Now, technically, the Viltrox can focus a little bit closer, and on paper, it has a very slightly higher 0.13 times magnification versus 0.12 times for the Sigma. But in practice, I found that the magnification looked pretty much identical in my eye, and I couldn't really see a measurable difference between the two. I also found that in a surprising way, the overall rendering and bokeh from these two lenses is surprisingly similar. I found that in many cases, you could probably blind swap them back and forth and ask people to pick which is which, and I suspect it'd be kind of hard for people to do that. They really do produce very similar type results. Now, how about some areas where there is some differentiation between the two, but it's not necessarily an advantage. It's more maybe a preference. So I would say that the Viltrox uses a bit more metals in its construction. It has a very nice magnesium aluminum alloy chassis here that's built around. The Sigma lens has a combination of metals and then what they call their thermal composites, engineered plastics. But, while the materials are a little bit different, the overall quality of build, it feels very similar. It basically comes down to a taste thing. The Viltrox has floating elements, and if you're not accustomed to those, it feels like something is kind of rocking around in there when the lens is turned off. Some people really don't like that, but it's a pretty common feature on higher-end lenses in modern lens design. The Sigma does not have that, and the reason for the floating elements is to enable better up-close performance, but because I found that the up-close performance was very similar between the two, and so we'll call that a neutral difference. I do probably slightly prefer the USB-C port that's on the lens mount, and it also, the Viltrox lens is Bluetooth enabled, and so doing firmware updates is a simpler process, technically than what it is on the Sigma. Of course, at this stage, however, the Sigma is 5 years old. There aren't probably any new firmware updates that are coming for it, so it becomes kind of a moot point there. So we'll start by looking at advantages for each lens with the Sigma, which is my venerable defender at this point. One area that the Sigma wins in is that I found that it had better contrast at large apertures. And if the look you want is to be really high contrast, the Sigma is a little bit stronger than the Viltrox in that regard. I also found that becomes true when it comes to up-close images. Where they have a similar degree of detail, there's definitely more contrast in the Sigma result, as you can see here, despite the floating elements in the Viltrox lens. The Sigma is slightly smaller. It is 82 millimeters in diameter versus 84 millimeters. It is 96 millimeters in length versus 105 millimeters. And so particularly when it comes to the length, there's a pretty significant difference between the two lenses. It is also considerably lighter. It weighs in at 625 grams. Again, they did a really great job of miniaturizing this lens versus the Art Series lenses for DSLRs of the previous generation. And so 625 grams is great. The Viltrox is a noticeably heavier 800 grams. I noted that there's one feature present here that the Viltrox doesn't have, and that's an iris lock. Iris lock can be very useful if either you want to lock into or lock out of the aperture ring. So if you're a person that doesn't like aperture rings and you want to keep it locked in the automatic mode, that iris lock will allow you to do it. You don't have to worry about inadvertently bumping out of there, or vice versa if you prefer the aperture ring. There is that kind of hard detent between f/16 and automatic on the Viltrox, but there isn't an iris lock. So score 1 for the Sigma in terms of the features. Neither one of these lenses has a significant amount of fringing, but of the two, the Sigma has less. It is very well controlled for longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, lateral too, but really longitudinal is what come into play more here. And you can see in this comparison that there is a little bit more fringing that is present on the Viltrox lens. I also found that though both lenses have a maximum aperture of f1.4, that at similar focus distances, I felt like the Sigma had slightly larger specular highlights, and so that can have certain advantages. And so I would say the aperture is ever so slightly larger on the Sigma than what it is on the Viltrox lens. And and remember that with all of these lenses, in many cases, there's just very a lens could be marketed, for example, as an 85 millimeter lens, and maybe it's 84.5 millimeters, or 85.5, or 86. There can be a minor bit of variance there, and that's also true here. I think of maximum aperture, that they're very, very similar, and so much so that they meter the same, but I think it's just very, very slightly, a tiny percentage larger on that. I also found that when I was comparing the two side by side, that the Sigma had better center sharpness. Not by a big margin, but of the two, I felt that it was the winner there, as you can see here. I also found that I liked the damping of the manual focus ring a little bit better, and so thus the overall feel I slightly preferred relative to the Viltrox lens. Viltrox is nice as well, and I could get similar kind of focus pulls out of the two, but of the two, I preferred the feel of the Sigma a little bit better. And so there are a number of reasons to choose the Sigma over the Viltrox. So how about reasons to choose the Challenger instead? Well, I think the biggest reason to choose the Viltrox over the Sigma is that the Viltrox is much cheaper. In fact, it's half the price, literally right under $600 versus right under $1,200. And so you could buy two of these Pro Series lenses for the price of one of the Sigma. Obviously, that's going to be a pretty significant factor when, all other things being equal. I also found that this Viltrox lens has a more modern autofocus system. It's got their new Hyper VCM focus motor, whereas the Sigma is using Sigma's older STM technology, and they have a new focus motor OSD that is fantastic, but this lens came before they had developed that focus motor, and so as a byproduct, I just felt like the Viltrox had the snappier autofocus, and it was, it's a little bit quieter, it's a little bit more sophisticated in performance, and so a win for Viltrox there. One huge optical difference between the two is that I always felt with the Sigma that what gave for Sigma's engineers in downsizing the lens to this size was they basically left a lot of uncorrected pincushion distortion, and so just relying on some software corrections for that. The Viltrox has a very minimal amount of distortion. That's not a factor at all. And so I could actually, without correction, I could definitely see the pincushion distortion. If I had straight lines, even in shooting at weddings, I could see it, and I definitely had to correct it. And so that's just not the case here on the Viltrox. Less of a big deal is that there is a little bit less of vignette on the Viltrox versus the Sigma lens. I mean, it's not significant. I used a +48 to correct for the vignette on the Viltrox. I used a +56 to correct for it on the Sigma, and so definitely not a factor that I would choose between these two lenses on, but a minor factor nonetheless. The Sigma is a little bit sharper wide open than what the Viltrox is, but the Viltrox is actually better in the mid-frame and into the corners. And so it's a little bit more of an even sharpness profile across the frame. I did note that the Sigma is the better in terms of having overall contrast. The trade-off of that can be is that there are situations where I felt like a little bit less contrast on the Viltrox actually produced a little bit more pleasing a background. And so, that a little bit less contrast in things that are out of focus actually has a beneficial effect, as you can see in this shot, for example. Another area when it comes to the video performance is that I felt like the video focus pulls are faster and more confident for the Viltrox. Again, it has that more modern focus system, and you can tell it's got a little bit more thrust going back and forth for those video pulls, and then also just a little bit more confident. There's a little less of the rocking when it gets to the destination, and so it does a little bit better job there. I also found that the Viltrox has significantly less focus breathing. It's not focus breathing free. However, the Sigma lens exhibits a much stronger amount of focus breathing as I pull in and out. By the way, this is shot at f11, and so depth of field, it's not really about that. You can just see that there's much more focus breathing that takes place. So that could be a factor for you, particularly since, because these are both third-party lenses, you're not going to get the focus breathing compensation in Sony cameras to digitally correct for that. One thing that is just kind of a practical factor is that the lens hood for the Viltrox is significantly narrower. You can see that I can actually put that lens hood inside the Sigma's hood. I always found that the Sigma's hood is quite large, and so as a byproduct, it just takes up more of a bigger footprint. Even if you have it reversed for storage, it means that it's wider in this way for storage, and even if it's set down, it has a larger footprint. It's taking up more room just in a camera bag or anything like that. And so I do prefer the hood here from the Viltrox, and that it's just a little bit narrower in that regard. So my conclusion is this: these are both really awesome lenses. The Sigma is smaller, lighter, and has a little bit more contrast, but the Viltrox is much cheaper, has a little bit better autofocus, has far less distortion. So is it price or weight which is the bigger determining factor for you? The Sigma is a well-established, reliable player, so if you already own the Sigma, I'm not sure I would sell it to buy the Viltrox unless you're wanting to try to make a little money and fund that towards something else. However, if you're fresh in the market, the value of the Viltrox is hard to deny. This is a ton of bang for the buck. Once again, we are spoiled for choice on Sony E-mount with some really fantastic 85mm lenses to choose from, and it looks like there are more to come on the horizon. If If you want more information, you can find in the description below linkage to my full reviews, both text and video, of these two lenses. And now if you'd like to see a head-to-head optical comparison, how I drew these conclusions, stay tuned with me right now. Let's jump into it together. Okay, let's start by taking a closer look at that pretty strong pincushion distortion that we see here on the Sigma lens. And you can see it's enough that it really stretches itself right away from the edges of the frame. And definitely if you're composing near the edge of the frame, you can see where the bends are, that if it's in this portion, if you don't correct it, you will see that warping of straight lines. Whereas here with the Viltrox does have the tiniest amount of pincushion distortion, but unless you were shooting a chart just like this, you frankly would just not see it at all. Likewise, there is a little bit more vignette here in the corners on the Sigma than what we see on the Viltrox, though that's less of a factor. Now, when it comes to longitudinal style chromatic aberration, you can see that the Sigma here on my right is pretty close to neutral, whereas the Viltrox definitely shows a little bit, particularly in the version of the greenish fringing that comes after the plane of focus. That's a little bit more apparent here on a three-dimensional object, where we can see in the shiny surfaces here on the old SLR, there is a bit of that fringing that shows up that just isn't present there on the Sigma. Likewise, if we take a look at the bokeh geometry here, the specular highlights for the Sigma lens, you can see, are just a little bit bigger. Now, they're also a little bit busier, so although they're in many ways, they're really more similar than different, but you can see that there is some of that fringing that persists around the specular highlights from the Viltrox in the case where the Sigma is neutral there. As you begin to stop the lenses down, here's how the geometry shapes out. In some ways, I think that the Viltrox is a little bit better in terms of the roundness. You can see that the Sigma stays a little bit more deformed there, just a little bit less of a round, kind of an otter shape, whereas this is not perfectly round, but at least it is round-ish, and so a little bit of an advantage for Viltrox there. Stopping on down to f2.8, I go back to giving a little bit of an advantage for the Sigma, not for the geometric shape, but for the fact that you can see a little bit more of the aperture shape than what you can with the Sigma. And so if that's the goal, Sigma's doing a little bit better job with that. Neither one of these lenses has any kind of issue with lateral style chromatic aberrations. You can see near the edge of the frame that they're both pretty much perfect. No problem with fringing popping up there. So if we take a look at resolution and contrast, both of these are shot on the Sony A7R Mark V, 61 megapixels, and these results are shown at 200% magnification. So as far as the actual detail that's present, both of them are very similar. In fact, the Viltrox may have very slightly better detail, but the contrast stands out more from the Sigma, and so in the center of the frame, it at least has the appearance of having better resolution. Now that's less true here in the mid frame. Again, they're very similar in resolution, but if anything, I would say that the saturation levels or the contrast here is very slightly better from the Viltrox lens. And if you look down in this corner, I like the Sigma better. But if you look in any other corner, the Viltrox looks better here. Up in this corner, Viltrox is looking better, particularly here as you get towards the edge, as you can see. And over in this corner, very clearly the Viltrox is superior there. And so overall, it's delivering just a little bit more consistent sharpness performance wide open at f1.4. If you stop both these lenses down to f2, the contrast advantage for the Sigma remains here in the center of the frame. It's improved more in the center. I would also say that its mid-frame performance has bumped up a bit, and down in this corner, it continues to look better. Up here, however, we can see that it's the Viltrox that's still winning, and likewise here, the Viltrox is just a little bit crisper and higher resolution off towards the edge of the frame. At f2.8, both of these lenses are ridiculously sharp. I mean, you're not going to be able to ask for more. I do think I like the Sigma a little bit better there, but both of these out in the real world performance, they're just so sharp that you're probably not going to miss anything. If you get off towards the edge of the frame, the Viltrox is better, but as you move back towards the rule of thirds area, Sigma is every bit as good, if not even a hair better. And so, I mean, they're both really, really good. At a 5.6, I do still think in the center of the frame, the contrast favors the Sigma lens. In this zone, they're both extremely, extremely good. Maybe a little bit more contrast for the Sigma, however. Up here in this corner, I would say that they're both still very, very close. And now you can see that the Sigma has closed the gap kind of in the extreme corner. Not 100% there, but very, very close. Now, as noted, while technically the Viltrox on paper has the higher level of resolution, we can see that it's not really the case. I mean, there may be a fraction of a percentage point more magnification, but I don't really see it. The superior contrast serves the, I think, the Sigma lens better here in that it stands up looking just a little bit better. And if we look even down into this zone, again, as you get closer to the edge of the frame, the Viltrox's advantage shows up a bit. It looks a little bit better in this zone. So, I mean, I would say they're just more similar than different as far as magnification. Using a three-dimensional object here too, you can see that I don't really see a higher level of magnification for the Viltrox here. I mean, they really look quite identical in overall performance. Now, as far as the rendering from the two lenses, I was actually quite surprised just how much they looked alike. And so, I mean, if you look at it in terms of resolution, they're very, very similar there, so that's not much of a difference. As I look towards these defocused areas, I think maybe there's a little more outlining for the Sigma, and the Viltrox is just a little bit softer, but you can see that if those were not side by side, I doubt you would see that. They're both really, really nice and smooth. Now, as far as this shot here, again, it's similar kind of results. You know, the resolution point is similar. As I look at areas like this, I mean, it's actually surprising how similar that autofocus rendering looks between those two. It's very, very similar. If we look in this zone here, again, they're very, very similar. It's in this shot where I felt like I liked the Viltrox just a little bit better, and it's mostly about this zone right here. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see that the higher contrast makes this darker, and so if we zoom back out, you can see that it just catches the eye a little bit more than what it does here on the Viltrox. But again, yes, I'm completely splitting hairs at this point. I look down in this zone, which is kind of complicated, and I mean, I think I like the Viltrox a little better, again, because of the lower contrast, but it's not like it's radically different either. One final difference here is you can see that as far as the color balance, they look, again, very similar. The contrast is a little bit stronger on the Sigma, and so you either, will like or not like that. On the actual subject, I would say that I do like it in that I feel like these kind of dark levels are just a little bit darker, and so it's, but again, if they weren't side by side at high magnification, I don't know that you could tell much of a difference. That's just how close these lenses are on so many levels optically. So thanks for sticking around to the very end, and I hope that the deep dive into the optics has helped to determine for you which one of these bad boys you'd like to own. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.